It's a great pleasure for me too, and an honour to be here to make a few remarks on this really important topic to such a distinguished audience. And I'd like to thank AIMA and the World Bank for making it possible. It's also always a pleasure to follow Gustavo Piga in speaking. It's actually quite a challenge to follow Gustavo Piga in speaking because he makes very clear and very pertinent points. We have worked together for many years, and although he's an economist and I'm a lawyer, it's surprising that actually we share very many views in common. And I think as a starting point, I'd like to say all too commonly, procurement is dominated by the legal rules. And those legal rules often have their roots in very old systems. And one of the really important things is before you start writing any procurement rules, laws, or even guidance, the most important thing is to know what it is that you're trying to achieve through those rules. Because only if you have clarity on that do you know where you're going. And so when I was asked to speak a little bit about smart procurement, I took a step back and thought, well, I don't quite know if I've really understood what smart procurement actually means. So you'll see on the slide here something I found from the European Union from a few years ago. And what they're trying to say essentially is better procurement in a way that's often talked about in the context of e-procurement. We want to reform processes, improve market access, promote integrity, and very importantly, improve the value that we get out of our procurement system. And that's not just in value for money, but it means in meeting the government's needs at the right price with the right quality and at a reasonable administrative cost. Now, for those of you who work in the procurement system and have done for many years, you'll all be familiar with some of the challenges in procurement administration. How many times do you need to go and get signatures to be able to go for the next step forward? And so part of the challenge here that I'm going to talk about is to place the procurement system in some context and follow up on some of what Professor Piga was saying, because just reforming your procurement system alone will not get us to the sunlit uplands of good analysis of our performance in the way that Professor Piga was talking about. So let's have a little look at what we can achieve through our procurement, improving our procurement system in a smart and data-driven way. And let's assume, I'm sounding like an economist now, let's assume that we have a good legal and regulatory enabling framework in place, and we all know we are trying to achieve better value for money, competition, so on and so forth. So that's a given. People often say to me, what is e-procurement? And everywhere I go, I get a different answer. So the first stage, if you like, of e-procurement is the list of things that you see on here, which is what India is looking at the moment. We have e-tendering, e-marketplaces, and so on. This is all about our interaction with the suppliers, those who are selling to the government. And why do we want to do this? It's so important. We give them better information. We give them information about our processes and the legal framework, and that's what we heard about the portal earlier on today. It's so important that this information is publicly available. It's much, much cheaper, both for the administration and for the suppliers, if the rules of the game are clearly known in advance. And very importantly, and this is where that portal will be so important, if they are the same in different ministries and across different systems and states. The less time you have to spend worrying about the details of the procedures because you know them, because they're the same, because they're publicly available, the less time both bidders and procurement officials have to spend on those administrative things, and the more time they have to spend on crafting their offers or making sure that their statement of needs is as good as it possibly can be to generate the best offers. Now, so we know that that is the first stage of e-procurement, and India is well on the way to achieving that. The second stage, which is really what Gustavo Piga was talking about, is where I think, if I can put it this way, the rubber hits the road. This is where, over the longer term, the real gains are to be had. We've heard about the use of data to allow for oversight over the entire procurement cycle and across procurement procedures. And I'm going to say something about the challenges of benchmarking in a moment. But here comes the next point. It's not just about the procurement system. If you integrate this with the rest of your state budget processes and all of the rest of your government system, you can have markers that will allow suppliers, instead of having to upload their information each time, you can put in a GST number for a business here in India. Everybody knows everything about you. You then don't need to re-enter a huge amount of basic data each time. There are huge amounts of potential in linking these sorts of things. And indeed, if a bidder has already got a criminal conviction for fraud somewhere else, you don't need him to confess about it. You may have an automatic link that flags up that you can look at. So there are huge amounts of procedural innovations there that you can be brought in too. I'm here on behalf of UNCITRAL. That's the UN Commission on International Trade Law. We have a model law on public procurement. It's been used as the basis, I believe, for the law in Rajasthan. I'm not sure about elsewhere in India, and I know you don't have a law at the federal level, though that may come in time. The UNCITRAL model law, which is accompanied by a very detailed policy guidance document, is all about that key question that Gustavo was raising. How do you balance discretion with transparency in public procurement? What do you do about that? We want to enable our best buyers to be able to use their commercial discretion, but we want to see that they are doing the right thing. Now, UNCITRAL requires a very detailed record of the procurement, each procurement to be kept. Now, traditionally, that was kept on paper, in a file, and somebody could pick up the file and look at it. But it was almost impossible, a bit like traditional auditing, to have any meaningful comparison across a series of procurements because it just took too long. Apart from getting hold of the files, it was very, very difficult to compare. And so e-procurement 2 here, ICT, has the opportunity to allow for some of that. And one of the things that UNCITRAL's rules also do is to take these principles that we've been talking about and put them into procedures. So when we say we want competition, we want transparency, that's all very well. What do we actually mean? So UNCITRAL says, exactly as was explained with the portal, you must publish all your rules, all your binding directives and your decrees at a ministerial type level. You must publish case law, that's really important. You must publish sensible guidance. But also, on a case-by-case basis, the model law explains what you must publish as a matter of law. That's the key things. What are you buying? And how will the buyer be assessed for whether he's qualified or whether the bid is responsive. But it's not the place of a law to go right down into every last detail and say, and you must have the telephone number of whoever it is. There are all sorts of things that may be more appropriate to reflect in other areas. They're still rules because they may need to change more regularly. Phone numbers change a lot. Inflation may mean you need to adjust thresholds and so forth. So it explains all of this, what you put in your law, what you put everywhere else. And the whole point about this is that it is a national focus. It's consistent with international policies and procedures, including those of the World Bank, but it's designed from the national perspective. So where you have policy goals, Make in India or whatever it is, it explains how you take a policy goal of that sort and put it into a legal framework so you can see how that's actually being applied. So then let's assume we have a good legal framework, as I said, and we want to introduce some commercial discretion for those with the competence to exercise it and the experience to do so well. And the first really important thing I would like to say here, and here we start talking about benchmarks. The procurement official, if we're talking about complex procurement, has a series of challenging decisions to take. It might be Do I engage in negotiations with the market? Do I have pre-procurement discussions with the market? Am I going to have an iterative procurement process? Am I going to finalise my specifications before I go to the market, or am I going to do it later in the procedure? And there are legal tools to allow you to do this. Now, what's key in all of those questions? There is no right answer. And so here, we require the procurement official to write down and justify the decisions that he's taking. That's about the procurement method, the criteria to decide who's going to win, whether or not sustainability criteria are going to be applied. Now, it's not clear to me from your Make in India process at the moment whether all procurements must have the same Make in India preferences or whatever it is. So in some cases, you must have these. In others, you may choose, since you may be saying, well, in fact, in this case, it's not appropriate because. Those are really key decisions, and they need to be written down and explained, and exactly how they will work in the process. So if there's going to be a price preference, how does it work with the quality criteria? When is it taken? All these things you need to decide in advance. Now, all of these decisions, of course, as Gustavo said, somebody could come and offer a bribe. And one of the things that is very concerning is that if you have all this discretion, how is it going to be overseen? Now, the traditional way was to say you have to go and get several levels of approvals higher up. What does that do? It's nobody's decision anymore. Nobody owns that decision. So there isn't the accountability that Gustavo was talking about, and the official that you want to trust, you aren't trusting. So for him, what is really his incentive structure? He will have to go and explain to somebody further up in the administrative hierarchy, I would like to do A, B, C, and D because I think the potential outcome is very good from this perspective. What is a typical, slightly scared middle manager likely to do? Is there a risk involved? Well, yeah, because this is innovative. Don't think we want to do that this time. And so one of the things that you really have to think about is how this sort of discretion sits in your administrative structure. I've worked with many countries who are really struggling with this because it is very hard to take away traditional safeguards. But if we are going to have this trust-based system, it really is quite a revolution. I don't have an answer for that. But the other thing about benchmarking is that if you do give the individual procurement official commercial discretion to take those decisions, and he goes down route X, justifies it, I think this, I believe that, I've done my research, and so on, you will always find an auditor or someone evaluating who will come along later and will say, well, I would have done something different in that situation. Now, if the first procurement official is then somehow sanctioned or told that he's done the wrong thing, what is the lesson he will learn from that? Don't do that again. Stick to what we've done before. Don't take any risks, because if you take no risks, you can't be criticised. We call it the big brother factor in some of the organisations that I've been working with. And this is one of the challenges with data. It's a knife, as Gustavo was saying. It can be used to frustrate any form of innovation because there are no right answers in these decisions that the procurement officials have to take. So here, I think there is a big risk, and we need to tackle it. We need to look very carefully at how we can go forward in the best way. But if it's done right, and if you have a good governance framework in place, then I think you can end up with a situation where procurement officials understand the commercial latitude that they are given, and that latitude is respected. And we see this in other cases too. We see this with doctors with medical negligence cases. It's very important to understand the difference between an honest mistake and negligence, and that is exactly the sort of analysis that we need to bring in crafting policies in this way. If we do it right, then obviously we have a lot of potential here to improve our oversight across procurements. And this is where the big data point comes in. We can measure performance and results, looking at learning lessons in a creative way. We can improve accountability. And then, as Gustavo so rightly says, with whom are we sharing all the data? We know about individuals, private companies, academia, civil society. And is there a concept of excessive transparency? Can we draw the line at meaningful transparency? And here I think there's two things. There are some things that we really should not be plastering all over the internet. And that is the sensitive information that those of you who come from the private sector view as your commercial advantage. You don't want that disclosed to all your competitors. The other thing is certain items that civil society might wish to oversee don't need to be overseen in real time. They're looking at long-term performance. So there is some data that you can release at a later stage which reduces some of the collusion risks and the cartel risks that Gustavo was talking about if you release it later. So UNCITRAL 2 talks a lot about the timing concerns. And the other thing is what I will call meaningful rather than excessive transparency. Now, I used to work as a commercial litigator, and in the system in which I worked, in the legal process, you had to disclose everything that was relevant to the other side. And traditionally, legal firms would spend a lot of time trying to hide information. So, well, there's a good reason we don't have to disclose this. Well, the other way of looking at it is give them everything. Bury them in so much unsorted information, they won't have a chance of finding what they're looking for. That is really what we have on the internet today. It's not we don't have enough information, we have too much information and we can't make sense of it. So here, this is where the role of portals and filtering mechanisms, exactly as we heard this morning, becomes so important. And the final thing on this here, I would say, is that there is a movement in some countries to publish the procurement contracts online. The UK government is doing it for the latest huge investment in railways known as High Speed 2. And the governments who are doing this are finding it's actually not causing them any challenge, and it is actually helpful as useful data, because it's one thing to see whether the procurement process went well, it's quite another to see what happens by the end of the contract. Because another old game, as Gustavo was saying, underbid and then make it up later on. But some governments are very sensitive about this, and I would like to encourage everybody to look at this as something that's really important. Publish the contracts online, you really will see the benefits. So we have e-procurement, as I've called it, I mean ICT really, providing lots of data sets. But how do you make the data accessible? In Latin America, for example, the government's always published, theoretically, all government contracts. Yeah, they were published. All you had to do was to go to the capital city and the library and give how many days' notice and exactly what contract you want, and eventually they'd find it from a dusty old tome in the stacks. Well, that's not really making it accessible, is it? So we've got to think about how we make it accessible. The Open Data Contracting Standard is actually one example of how to do this, to provide structured, standardized open data in documents, going beyond just the big data, but a lot of that too. But really important about this is that the way that the data is presented allows you to compare it. Quite a lot of publication of procurement-related information is in PDFs. Well, PDFs are great. PDFs are brilliant if you want to read one document. PDFs are not good if you want to try and cross-compare. So it's trying to move beyond the publication, start getting into the details of how you would do this. And obviously, if you have this cross-compare data, you can then look at patterns across procurements. Subject to what I said earlier on, how are you going to use that tool? Are you going to do it to empower your procurement officials, or are you going to do it to terrify them? And if you do it to terrify them, then you might as well not bother, because you're not going to get the results that you're looking at. So here's a little bit about the Open Data Contracting Standard. And one of the things, I have to say I'm a lawyer, I'm not a technician, I don't actually know what a data schema for validation of published data is, but the people who run open data tell me it's really important and very useful. Maybe Gustavo knows what it is, but I'm afraid I'm not quite sure. What I understand is it's ensuring the technical accessibility of data and facilitating the evaluation of outcomes. But here again too, do we have the resources to look at this? It's all very well saying, well, we'll publish it all in this nice cross-comparable format. Who's going to look at it? Civil society? Well, A, they've got their own things that they're looking for, and B, they're little organizations without great resources. Part of the investment that you need to make is in the people, and here, perhaps, these are people, not robots, who will be taking the conclusions that you can draw from data analytics and feeding them into the policy process. There's huge numbers of challenges here. I think ICT offers us a lot of potential. There are things that we need to do to be careful in how we implement it, but the potential is really there. Now, some of the documents that I've talked about are available on the UNCITRAL website. I don't know if I've got a red thing? Oh, no, I haven't. I've just destroyed that. The guide to enactment, which those of you with brilliant eyesight can see is about the third line down, that is a policy guide about this thick on implementing an effective procurement system based on the UNCITRAL model law, but it's a very big policy document. We are going to be updating it soon to have more information on the sorts of things that I've talked about, because that policy guide, as you can see, was issued in 2012. So in the terms of what things have happened, it's a little bit out of date, but the key principles are all there. And UNCITRAL works with the World Bank and all of the other MDBs to support capacity development in this area. And so we're very happy to talk to anybody who's struggling with some of the policy aspects in particular. Thank you very much.